Welcome to Art with a Conscience, Beyond Architecture. Given that today's discussion is part of a series crafted by the Council for Canadian American Relations, and the border that lies between our two countries plays a powerful role in our dynamics, I've decided to use the concept of borders as a central theme. In my mind, borders support the notion of boundaries, delineations that can serve to be open and welcoming, but they can also be charged with the task of keeping people out. I'd like to look at museum design and discuss the challenge of creating inclusive spaces that are welcoming to a vast array of communities that venture to their entrances. In addition to that complex requirement, do museums or galleries actually bring art to the people? Does museum architecture provide a built environment conduit that allows art to be powerful, or is it caught in the muck and mire of physical, social, economic, and political constraints, which degrades the notion of what a piece of public art is? I feel like the style of this conversation is to make the most of the fact that we have three compelling, thoughtful, and interesting individuals who bring to the craft of architecture and art a viewpoint that is respectful, insightful, and powerful. With that, I'd like to introduce Faheem Majeed, Annabelle Selldorf, and Brian Porter. Faheem Majeed is an artist, professor, curator, and community facilitator. In 2016, Majeed founded the Floating Museum, an art collective that creates new models for exploring relationships between art, community, architecture, and public institutions. Majeed blends his experience as an artist, nonprofit administrator, and curator to create artworks focused on institutional critique. His exhibitions leverage collaboration to promote meaningful dialogue among his immediate community as well as a broader one. Behind us, on the right, is an image of Freedom Stand, an homage to the role of Black newspapers in the US that was found on the High Line until late spring of this year. Annabelle Selldorf is a German-born architect and principal of Selldorf Architects, a 70-person architectural design practice she founded in New York City in 1998. Selldorf received, in 1988, you're right. Selldorf received a bachelor's in architecture from Pratt Institute and a master's in architecture from Syracuse University. She is a fellow of the AIA. Current projects are the expansion and renovation of the Frick Collection here in New York City, the redesign of the Sainsbury wing of the National Gallery in London, and major expansion to the Art Gallery of Ontario. Behind us, in the middle, is a depiction of the Art Gallery of Ontario in its future incarnation. Annabelle Selldorf will lead the design in collaboration with Brian Porter of Two Row Architect, sitting to her left, and the firm Diamond Schmidt. Brian Porter, Onondaga, is an Indigenous architect from the Six Nations of the Grand River and principal of Two Row Architect, which he founded in 1992. He graduated from the University of Toronto with a master's in architecture. Two Row Architect is a 100% Native-owned business operated from the Six Nations of the Grand River, First Nation, and I'm going to say it wrong, Tekaronto. Tekaronto.
Toronto for the rest of you.
This practice promotes meshing traditional symbols into current building technology while actively promoting the creative and environmentally conscious use of building materials, as you can see on the left-hand side. Thus, the built environment is hugely important for the obvious physical reasons, but also on the subconscious and nuance level. These concepts are debated and represented quite a lot in today's world. But the wonder is, are we able to make these debates and the results successfully answer the needs of communities and the myriad of cultures that must be acknowledged, served, and supported? And with that, who would like to begin?
Oh, my goodness.
There's a lot.
I'll jump in.
Okay.
Your question that you started us out with, number one, just thank you for having me, and thank you to Bruce and Vicki for the invitation. I'm really honored to be here. But the concept of borders and boundaries, I think a lot in my Floating Museum Art Collective, it kind of came out of this, like adjacent museum structures, right? It's not a counter museum structure. It's almost like kind of easily put museum without walls. And I spent a lot of time in Chicago, been there about 20 years, working in an arts nonprofit that often, you know, we had a very supportive community. And, you know, we were under $200,000 budget. And whenever we worked with an art institute or an MCA, you know, that would want to come down and do something exchange-wise, it always felt like there was a disconnect. But after, you know, showing in those spaces and then starting to understand the challenges of both spaces, everyone has the same challenges. It's always not enough space, not enough capacity, and not enough money. It's like, I don't care, you can go all the way up to the top, to the bottom. Everyone's trying to fight for those three things. But you know, in a lot of ways, I think too much pressure is put on to museums, the expectation that it is all things, and it needs to be all things. This notion of bringing art to people versus building art together. Leaning into people's expertise versus asking people's opinions on things that they don't really have much training in is something that we lean into a lot in thinking about collaboration. In a lot of ways, we think about, like, everyone needs to eat at the dinner table. So we want community in the space, because I actually don't think it's bringing art to people in the museums. It's actually wanting people to come to the museums, because the museums has needs of, like, numbers. They need people to come through the doors, which is valuable. But the presentation of that versus working with a community, a group, which are all kind of loaded terms, to build something together creates situations where reciprocal relationships, because it's not about just coming, it's coming back, and then coming back, and then coming back. And I think in the design process, whether it be in the building of the thing, or the curation of the thing, or the programming of the thing, that is something that has to, if you want that reciprocal relationship, you have to bring those voices in much earlier. It's not about, I always say, it's not about having quote unquote black faces on the wall, it's about having a voice at the beginning so that I see myself in the creation of that thing, which makes me implicated in its success. So that's a design principle that we put in all of our projects, as well as our curation, everything we do. We start very early with, we call it breaking bread. It's just basically sitting around, drinking coffee and eating chicken. That's what we do. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Brian, talk about Shelburne and the collection of Shelburne and what we had just talked about, because in my mind that sort of dovetails interestingly to what you were talking about and brings a little bit of definition how we think about a museum as a deposit of art versus something that is more interactive, perhaps.
Yeah, we're working at the Shelburne Museum, which is just a little bit south of Burlington in Vermont. And we've had the privilege of conducting a number of talking circles with experts from all across Turtle Island. The collection is very, very diverse, the Perry collection. It's comprised of pieces, indigenous pieces from Alaska, from the Southwest, from the heartland as well. And we're in the situation where, you know, we want to honor the Abenaki, who are consider that area to be within their traditional homeland, but we've got this very diverse collection that we need to represent in a new building. And it's been really interesting through the talking circles. One of the things that's really come out about the objects is the objects have a spirit, the objects have a life. They're intended to be used regularly for ceremony. They're intended to be touched. And so when people come to engage with those pieces to give them life and so that there can be a continuum, you want a place where that can happen in an appropriate setting, but also when you take the piece away, you don't want to like stick it on a shelf in a box, because it's we consider it those objects to be part of our family. Mm-hmm. So it's been really, really interesting. It's the first time that I've had a chance to be involved in a new build where a collection right now is sitting in boxes, and we're going to kind of bring it out into the light, so to speak. But yeah, they've been very, very interesting conversations.
It's a fascinating idea to think that the objects in a museum are part and parcel of the interaction itself, right? Mm-hmm. And it kind of upends notions of conservation or value, for that matter, not higher or lower per se, but very different. Having said that, not all things are the same in all museums. Again, sort of touching on what you talked about, Bridget, with boundaries and the notion of welcome. I think welcome starts with really wanting to be welcoming, and that's a state of mind. And there's, you know, many ways in which people perceive that they are invited, that they are welcome. And let's just say everybody is welcome. How do you communicate that? I don't per se think it's in the first place an architectural question. It's also an architectural question. And I have to say that the work that we're doing at AGO, for me, has been nothing short but revelatory. Is that the right word? Because we did have a chance, for one, to work in a team of 3 architects. I had never worked with an indigenous architect before, and I had absolutely no idea what to expect. Well, I found out that we are largely thinking the same thing. But Brian and his team always have a different way of talking about it. And to me, that was really fascinating. How to use materials, how to make spaces where people feel not just at home, but central to the place, perhaps? Is that a way to say it? How when we build, we have to think about how we impact nature, and a myriad of things. I hope that in turn, our dialogue has also been resonant for you, and not to forget the third architect, Diamond Schmidt. Don and his team have been absolutely spectacular. But you already knew each other a little bit, and anyway, so I think about galleries, I think about proportions, I think about light, I think about structure, and in some ways, I have a very well-formed, and I say I should always say we, but I've been sort of leading my team with the design work around art. And so we think in code. How high, how wide, how long, how do you circulate? And there is a degree of expertise, I would call that. But that's worth nothing if you can't bring other sound waves or whatever, other vibrations into the thing. And so just in summary to say, nothing is ever the same.
Can I respond to that?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, that's, yes, when you talk about code, I mean, I'm curious if there's even a term for museum. I mean, there's museum in the sense of like a Western sense, because museums, in the way I understood it, were kind of there to house and protect the objects, the collections. The people were secondary. Like, the people were kind of like, okay, we're going to house it so people can see it and appreciate it. But first and foremost, to your point, we have to think about storage of the collection. We have to think about presentation of the collection. It's, you know, and then because we want the museums to do these things. Now I'm thinking, yes, there's many different types of museums. So I'm talking very broad here. But like the Cabinet of Curiosities was all about like colonizing, like keeping safe. We're going to state what's valuable, because now it's valuable that it's here. It's not necessarily valuable in the same sort of way to us, you know, to the people who have the capacity to do that. But, you know, in a lot of ways, I don't have a problem with that. I don't. I mean, because I love going to museums. I love walking in. I have this great story. I was working on the west side of Chicago. And I often was the guy that gets invited in to do like, how can we get more diverse people to come to the museums? You know, at the Art Institute, you know, like, you know, really nice steak, food, great, very fancy. And I come in and I'm like, well, you know, I just passed by a family of Polish people and like, you know, and I don't know, South Asian, Bangladeshi. I say, y'all doing pretty good on diversity down there. It's like League of Nations. They're like, oh no, not that diversity. That's not why you're here. No, we want black and brown. So, you know, it kind of started this thing of like, this notion of being myopic, of thinking about there's one solution, like you're saying. Like there's a diversity of different types of museums, missions, it's all about those missions. But I say, you know, if you want people in that space, you just need to talk to the people and talk about the value. And there's a lot of assumptions that are being had. When I went back to the West Side and said, hey, you know, I know there's issues with the Art Institute and you're not really interested, you know, the youth counselor was like, no, that's not a problem. Well, we love the Art Institute. And you know where we go? They don't go to the contemporary art, they go to the Renaissance paintings and they sit and they look at those masterful works. That's where all the kids spend their time. There's a lot of assumptions being made. The challenge was transportation and timing. The kids get out of school at 3 o'clock. We have to get them back by 5. So there's these other things that are in a way that if you don't communicate on the front end, if you do in fact want those people in the space, if you can't like make presumptive design decisions, if you in fact, like that's their expertise. Their expertise is understanding what it takes to live on the West Side and what it takes to get downtown. If you talk about value, horizontal value, and you're transparent about that, you're valuable in this space. We really want you to, what can we do to have that conversation, make that happen? Just flat out talk about that. Then it happens versus coded, where it's like community, diversity. You know what I mean? Like just get to the beginning, and sometimes, you know, or you say, hey, we would like more indigenous people in the space. We want to work with well, I can tell you why that's not working, or expertise can tell you. It seems sometimes kind of obvious when you start having a conversation. You're like, oh yeah, that's really obvious. But yeah, just lastly, it's like also this notion of bringing art to people. We had to cancel that out. Our funders in the beginning, because we would do pop-ups around the city. The idea was furthest away from the cultural center. Well, there's already art in the communities. There is no bringing art to a community. That's a very problematic, like, thought process, right? It's about what you say when you say that. What you're saying is there's a hierarchical structure of what's valuable and what's not valuable from a certain perspective, right? So there is no going to the community for art. The community already has art. You're just coming into it, right? So a lot of times we try to figure out who's doing what and how can our exchange actually be mutually beneficial. The museums have needs, just like the community has needs. And sometimes those things together actually help to satisfy something. So yeah, I love museums. But I also understand the museum's limitations. They're huge. They move slow. Yeah, they're hard. It's hard to move. Just this event alone was really challenging getting here, right? Like, yeah, it was hard. Like, if we were at home, it would have been much easier. But it's hard.
I never really thought of that before, but I don't think we have a word for museum in the traditional language.
It's culture. It's cultural production, right? Life.
Yeah. If you think about a traditional longhouse, it's residential, it's social, it's administrative, it's celebratory, it's ceremonial. So it's all of these things kind of interwoven, right? And it's really hard to kind of like pull at the threads to kind of separate those things, right? It's all kind of interwoven. And I think when we met with some of the people early on at the AGO, those were the kinds of things we were hearing from some of the Indigenous advisors was, you know, they wanted to be involved early on in the conversations. At the end of the day, they wanted to understand that they had equity in the institution, that it was their amenity, and that they would have the ability to bring whatever kind of programming they wanted to the facility. And I think, you know, without those conversations, I think they really had an impact on what we did with the design.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it sort of set the stage for a wider point of view that is inclusive of Black and brown people, of Indigenous people,
right.
really of everybody.
Yeah.
And Toronto is so interesting, and the AGO is so interesting because the people who go are from everywhere in the world, and you know, there are demographic studies about who goes to museums. For the most part, it's middle-aged ladies like us. And we go to the shop and buy, like, clothes for the grandkids. But at AGO, that's actually not true. The majority of people who go are under 30. And I think it is a little bit what you are talking about, is sort of defying the cliche that makes, that sets up the museum to just being a place where you have to go if you are if you're that kind of a person on Sunday afternoons, you go to the museum. No, what we want, what you want, I think what all of us want is engagement, and engagement for a reason, engagement that resonates. I also think you want it to be non-coercive in terms of how you think or what you discover. And much as that is the case, there are things to know and to learn. And when you're saying there wasn't a term for a museum, the first museum is very, very old. It was a woman, of all things, who started a museum in Mesopotamia, and she brought the things her father, who was sort of an archaeologist, if you can say that, and she displayed different things that were found around pottery, I don't know. And she labeled them for people to see them. And she labeled them in multiple languages.
Wow.
And I think that's a totally fascinating thing, because contrary to a museum just being a repository of things that are shelved away and dead, there is something that I think is germane to us humans, is to sort of gather stuff and keep it. And I mean, we can always question the need to own things. I would say we're at an all-time high of people consuming like there's no tomorrow. And maybe there is no tomorrow, but but there's something very instinctual about all that as well, right?
I feel that we've entered a notion, I mean, even the fact that we're having this conversation and that we're feeling that we can explore these elements and that we can investigate really what the notion of a museum is. And it actually brings to my mind that actually I love every kind of museum. I love the history of each museum. I love that there are Kunstkammer and that they have their moment, and you can reflect on, again, what the social history is, and it's very telling. And certainly one of the reasons why I was drawn to your work was the idea of a floating museum, the idea that you could sort of meander down the waterway and people would, be there and responding. And you're absolutely right when you say to define what is art is to really, I mean, demean any sort of expression that would ever be labeled as art. Because frankly, there's so much art in between the gaps, aren't there? But what I found is something that runs through all of your work. It's certainly when I've explored the work you do on a new medium, which is literally YouTube. The amount of incredible information and learning I did just by going onto something that we would never think would be the conduit for that. You talk about talking circles, and I know that had a huge impact with the AGO, but for me, was it talking or was it listening? And that, I think, seems to be the something extraordinary that's happening, that all listening becomes probably one of the most productive elements that we have, and it's actually being heard.
That's very
I value
nicely
that.
put. Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah.
So we call them talking circles because the community's talking and we're listening. We usually aim for about 95% listening and about 5% talking. You know, we might go to these sessions with 4 or 5 questions, purposely vague questions in our back pocket, right? To ask, you know, how can your culture be appropriately expressed in this building? You know, there's never a right or wrong answer. And in the best sessions, we don't even get to the questions. The people just sit down and they start talking, and we take notes feverishly to try to capture it all. And then we'll give it back to them in draft form so they have a chance to kind of redline it. You know, did we hear you accurately? Is there something that we missed? And we'll take those edits and we'll incorporate them into sort of a findings document. And that's something that we would refer to at every stage of the project. You know, are we still on track? Are we still being faithful? Are we still being transparent? So it's a really, it is a listening skill that we try to practice on every project when we can. There are some projects where you can't, and those are sort of frustrating. You know, you get into these competitions, right? And they're all anonymous, and you've got to come up with this wonderful design without having the benefit of
Let's not talk about those.
of that kind of engagement. And I really feel handcuffed severely when we're not able to reach out to the community.
Yeah, it's hard to present a process because people are just like, well, what does it look like? It's going to be great.
Yeah.
You know, but the process produces quality results. We always are trying to present a process. And it's the same process, whether it's curating a biennial or photography exhibition at the Art Institute. It's the same process. It starts with breaking bread. In your case, you talk about a circle.
But I understand what Brian is talking about. Sometimes the process is imposed on us. And
Yes.
like, I think the talking circle that we had for AGO was one of the more profound experiences for me. But whenever you talk to constituents, you get so much back, right? And like you say, if people talk on their own, that's great. If not, you can ask questions and sort of get a lot back that way. But many times in the role that we are in as architects, the process is imposed on us. And I agree, it's like when it's anonymous and when we compete and we think, but we haven't had any conversations with anybody. It's not just the constituents, not the client. How are you gonna go about establishing a relationship? And fundamentally, I think anything that works out well is a result of relationships.
Well, that leads me to the question of, and you've actually sort of leaned on it a little bit, is when you get something, a building that you are to either enlarge in or build as a new build, and you get given the sort of the ability, your bandwidth is that you can explore and you can respond to the community. But then you find out that perhaps the community is actually very limited. It's the community, they like to speak in sort of grandiose tones in terms that everyone is actually included, but you start to discover that it's actually a very set community. And I'm feeling that there could be some instances that I certainly, when I was doing my research, I would have thought that that would have been a really tough place to be in. You know, they wanted to check some boxes, but in fact, you're actually very constrained. And so maybe if you could speak to that in the different projects you've come across.
I can speak to it in terms of art, but not in buildings. I mean, you're 100% right in there is an imposed process of how architecture is built. And there is a little bit of cart before the horse, maybe, and just like before you actually run the process and make the proposal, you have to put something down because you can't maybe just, but I don't, you know, that's a very challenging thing. But I mean, I can speak to it in terms of big projects, in the terms of understanding expertise. I actually don't, we talk about, we don't actually work with community. We work with people who work with community. We don't actually have the capacity to work with, because our community would be the whole city, and that's just not realistic for one organization. So we work with a multitude of organizations or individuals that work in those spaces, right? And there's a kind of a ripple effect that happens. But also treating community members as consultants. We pay our community members that come on and start giving advice because, no, I don't need you to come and paint a mural when you just picked up a paintbrush yesterday. No, absolutely, that could make for a terrible mural. But what I need you to be an expert in is the 40 years of you living in this neighborhood. And that's valuable. I'm paying, if you are a consultant with 40 years of experience, that's a pretty expensive consultant. You understand? So I need you to talk about life. I need you to talk about this. And then, like you're saying, I pull inspiration from that, and then we'll come back to you. But I don't need you to, like, because whenever we say art, everyone immediately go to what they know it's art or as architect, and they're like, yeah, that's just not interesting. But I've been, you know, we're going to work together. And that's what it is. So that's how we handle that. And we're very upfront about that when we talk to them. We're like, no, you're not designing the artwork. We're designing the artwork. Right. We're going to work together on that. So just, yeah, that's how we manage that. Don't kind of let those things get away from you. Yeah.
I've said a few times lately is like I felt kind of like a palpable change. Maybe 5 years ago, I'm not sure what it was, where the box checking kind of ended. Mm-hmm. And for the last, I don't know, 3 or 4 years, it's felt there's a lot more, there's a lot more sincerity. Excuse me, on the other side of the table. The other thing I'm really excited about working in 2024 is we're getting involved with a lot more multidisciplinary consortiums really, really early on. And so we're sitting beside the arborist and the landscape architect and the civil engineer, and we're all there really, really early. So I think the solutions are becoming a lot more about the community, about the place, about the history. So I don't know what it was that kind of turned the ship away from the kind of the starchitect dropping a solution into a community. It seems like in Canada, at least, that's really kind of slowed down. I'm not sure how it is in the U.S., but.
I think the way you describe the process is very important because one has to not get things mixed up. Only because you're talking to the community and to the constituents does not mean that you expect them to tell you what to do. They get that mixed up sometimes.
Often.
Thank you. But what is interesting is public process. For example, in New York City, you have to go to community board hearings. And the hardest thing is the lack of respect. We respect and want to hear people's opinions, but that does not mean that it invites insult and and old tomatoes. I think in some ways it is better, and architecture is not an isolated profession. It takes a village. It takes all of the people that Brian was just bringing up, and the landscape architect may bring an idea that you had never considered before about the site, and so this big collaborative effort is very sincere to begin with, always has been, and maybe misrepresented by individuals perhaps, but looping in the community and the public in a way where they can genuinely contribute, much in the way in which you described. I think that's a really important thing to establish.
So we've talked about community, and I have to say I'm just really intrigued, and I was thinking of how I should approach this, but really I just want to say, is there a chance that we could perhaps go back to your roots? You know, I know I'm very fond of a story that you and I spoke about, and the piece that you first created, and it was rudimentary, I think, in a way, but yet it was a celebration of you using a material and you executing a vision you had. And then there was a long journey as you started to move into spaces that you considered, what is this representing, or what would I like to represent, and the notions that were starting to come through in your work. And I loved that journey, because honestly, it gave me a little hope that if I just take a few basic materials, I too could eventually explore to new levels. And then I know, Brian, that you and I spoke about really what is it and when did you start to consider being an architect? And it was very much rooted, your response was very much rooted in really just a way of life and a way of committing to the community. And it was really about relationships that eventually gave rise to you thinking, wait, perhaps this is the road that I travel. And I thought that was important and needs to be underlined. And then, Annabelle, we had spoken about your journey to the US to come to school here. And even just recently, we spoke about the notion of, 30 years ago, is this what you thought you would be doing? And so that's an open conversation, it's an open question, but I'm sort of interested in some of those moments, those individual moments that have led to you being here on stage.
Architecture is a really interesting thing. People always chuckle when I say architecture is the mother of all arts. Mm-hmm. It's not funny, however. I mean, architecture is a lot of things, and it's not like you can build a house and now it's architecture. Architecture is all of the things that you want to include, and then a whole lot more that you might as well not want to deal with. But it is about finding a reason why architecture propelled you forward to being, I risk being maybe a little corny, but being a better person. And it takes time. It takes so much time because there's so much to understand about how we create environments and the built environment, what is healthy, what is appropriate, set your values of relative to expertise, shall we say, understand how things are put together, accept that you can never capture everything the first time around. Yeah, I've been in practice for nearly 40 years. And I think I've only recently understood that I want two things. I want the art of architecture to really continue to matter in the way it always has. But I can only be proud of it if it does so many other things. And these other things I used to not articulate because maybe I was shy, because they would be big words. They would include, it's so easy to say, oh, let's be inclusive of community. No, it's so much more than that, and to sort of think that you actually take part in shaping the environment, in making places that are welcome. And like I said, it's not in the first place just about architecture, but to project your own attitude to that, to be curious about other people's point of view, rather than saying, well, that'll be interesting if this person says something good that fits my way of thinking about it, but taking the time to let things resonate and taking the time to think. I grew up looking at art. From a very early age, my parents dragged us to look at art in museums, in churches, in people's houses, wherever. Very familiar to me. I'm not intimidated about going into a museum. But I do realize that museums are intimidating. I actually mind it when spaces are super loud because people are screaming. But I'm also learning to accept that we can't have it be the same thing. So, in other words, the journey is to always push you to open the door, to expect more, and to appreciate more, I think is really sort of that funny spot that you find yourself in. I don't know how else to say it.
I was both blessed and cursed to be born into my family. My father had 5 brothers, and there was always a project going on somewhere, right? Adding a porch, adding a bedroom, tearing something down, right? And these guys were, they were insane. They would talk about a job that would maybe take 15 minutes, but they'd talk about how to do it for about 45 minutes, right? And my father was the youngest, so it would go Roger, Albert, David, Joe, Gus. It would go. The decision would go up the line, right? And then it would come back down, and so I had to witness that. I usually carried the water and the nails, whatever, and even after I graduated university, like, my opinion still didn't count for anything. It counted for nothing, right? But I, excuse me. I get a little bit choked up when I think about those guys. But it got me very, I was never afraid to build anything. It was also very collaborative, very interactive. So probably why I'm here.
Yeah. It's beautiful. That's beautiful. I think about my two halves. I had this idea of this art family. Your art family is kind of not made up of people who immediately sometimes impacted you, but kind of influence, how you make things, how you think. And for me, I was trained as a metal sculptor on the East Coast, Howard University, and I was the only sculpture major. And every day I would go on campus and I would see the work by Richard Hunt. And Richard Hunt, for those that don't know, he just passed away. Phenomenal metal man. He was like Ogun. He just died with hammers in his hand, right? And his work just defined space. You couldn't be in that space without it kind of defining space. And I was very fortunate. I got to spend some time with him as a metal sculptor starting out. And he just worked. There's no conceptual conversation. There was no, it's like, I'm going to be here at 5 a.m. You can come work or not. No hard, he just worked. He worked up into it. And that work ethic, the scale was amazing to me, this notion of making monuments. And then when I went to Chicago, I met my grandmother, Margaret Burroughs. Margaret Burroughs was a teacher and a printmaker who studied in Mexico. And kind of made small things, right? But she also founded the first museum of African American history in her home. Not because she wanted to find a museum, but because the lack of diversity in the curriculum at the time, she asked for them to change it, and they didn't. And she said, I'll just do it myself. So she started taking her kids to her house. Then the community came in and started, hey, how much is it to get in a museum? And she's like, museum? Yeah, I don't know, $1. And they was, okay. And then she realized, oh, there's a value here, and now I'm at this moment of like, there's no museums of African American history. So now I gotta go learn about museum making, right? But also there's an issue with food. So now I gotta feed the babies, right? There's no theater. So it's this notion of like building like truly community-centered design process and then going out and responding to that. So I have these two people. I have one who left her monuments and people, and then I have one who literally left monuments. And I like to think those two things, for me, are what really help to define the types of work that I do, both as a sculptor, but then as this person, like invested in kind of impact and in people as well. So these two people really help to shape me. Yeah. I have a bunch of cousins and aunts and uncles too. We'll just stick with those two.
Well, I'm wondering about the time right now, because I have a feeling that there's probably some questions in the audience, because I can keep going, because I will. But I think it's time. Is there anyone who is interested in asking a question then that we can go ahead? Do you need a microphone then?
Oh, here it comes. It's a beautiful story.
I can never get through.
There's one just coming up behind you right now.
I hate when somebody asks that.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you to CCAR. I'm absolutely loving this discussion. So my name's Sarah. I call myself an international Canadian. So I'm born in Toronto, so I understand your Branksome past, perhaps. I've lived in the States. I've lived 30 years in the UK, actually, and I also spent a few years in Hong Kong, so I know a little bit about culture from a different perspective. But the reason I want to ask a question is about the young. So maybe because I'm a Canadian, I've been very trusted by many different people in London. So I set up a school for the kids who get kicked out of school. And that went on to be, I was asked by Sadler's Wells to go on their board because they're interested in doing a school, and it was a school for breakdancing. Sadler's Wells, just so everybody knows, has been the center of breakdancing. And to make sure everybody also knows, breakdancing's part of the Paris Olympics, but it's not part of LA. But it's allowed me a really interesting perspective on the young. So we would take them to like the George Wallace collection in London, and we'd get, who wants to keep this stuff? We'd take them to over the other side to some of the more contemporary collections. They were much more interested in Starbucks. Then we would take them to see the Anthony Gormleys across all the rooftops. That's neat. And I just sort of think, we've talked about tomorrow, and what does tomorrow bring? Well, what I see tomorrow brings is we are really questioning the structures of today, particularly education. Now, I could go on my soapbox about education, having seen what the British education system expects. But the point is, society's moving at a faster pace than many of these structures. It's a big question mark. What's the value of university. We have to ask ourselves as we hit AI, you know, the arts is so important in preserving our culture, what does it mean, humanity? And when I work with disenfranchised young people, I can't tell you the value of belonging. And we talk about the value of belonging in certain cultures. So I did my degree at Hong Kong University in Chinese psychology. You try being Asian in a family, your voice never matters. You're at the back of the line for generations and generations. And then we have our our media of today. It brings us so much information, but it also bubbles us. So, what is the value of our institutions in preserving what is culture? And what is the culture to the young? And I just sort of think they bring a lot that we will enjoy if we allow that into what we're doing. So I hope that's not too long-winded. My question is about what are we doing about the voice of the young for tomorrow?
Okay. You mind if I jump in? Go ahead. First, I just wanted to say to the MoMA, I know they released images of their work online, which was, if I'm not mistaken, they made them open access, which is really huge and a very big deal. But also, I mean, your example right away when you talk about being a young person going and seeing things over and over and over, those seeds, it seems like they're not paying attention, but they come back as they mature. And I think that's so important, even if they just want to go to Starbucks. I mean, it doesn't matter what country you're in, they're always going to end up in Starbucks when they go, or McDonald's or whatever. But it plants a seed that you just don't know how it's going to come back. But I do think it is a challenging conversation to talk about the role of the museum in many teaching institutions as well in the age of technology, where information comes so much quicker as well. And it's about being relevant. It's all these institutions about, even design, it's about how are you relevant to the contemporary? How are things standing up? How, or is it just propped up because it's always been? I think that's a disastrous model as well. So these are challenges that I think releasing your holdings online digitally, having more digital platforms to engage with people who are getting, it's something that all the institutions are fighting and struggling and trying to stay ahead of, but it is not a small challenge. It's a huge undertaking. Yeah. So something we don't have a museum, so that's why. Museum without walls, but adjacent models.
You've said it. I don't think we need to add any more.
I think for us, I mean, listening to them is important, right? When we have these engagement sessions, we want to make sure we hear from the young, from the elders. We try to make things as participatory, as we can. So I guess I'm not really sure I have a subsection for you.
Exactly.
I'm not sure.
I think we have another question here.
Hi there. Just sort of picking up a little bit on that question and that whole idea of the notion of interaction and participation, and I'm particularly interested in how it informs design. I was just at the MoMA Museum in Hobart, Tasmania, a week ago, and there's this whole notion of the building being as much a spectacle as the art which is inside of it, even to the point where they had a number of James Turrell exhibitions that they called the rides. And so as you're sort of thinking about curating space for the Instagram generation, how does that, used to be the museum was how do you create as simple a form as possible to allow the art to come forward? And that seems to be changing in some design principles, so I'd be curious to sort of hear about how that's impacting your process.
I'm just going to look over to Jessica right now and ask how we're doing with time. So we're doing well. Okay, is there another question that we could maybe, Jessica.
Well, no, yeah, can we answer just?
Oh, sorry.
Right. I was going to joke and say we just need to make a bunch of all the artists just need to have selfie booths where they just, but I think there's often this thing of like one or the other. And that's, I think there's ways to engage technology that make you actually want to engage with space too. It doesn't have to be one or the other, but I do think in design, oftentimes we're thinking about a multi-tiered experience that can happen. One of our biggest arguments that we've been trying to think about is if you have the content, you have replicas, you have duplicates of collection objects, which is why I go back to the MoMA releasing its collections online, and people are digesting that, I don't know, somewhere else. Should that not count for engagement in the space because it's coming from the space? So I just think like taking challenging ways of thinking about, like maybe breaking how we think about things a little bit, that could be mutually beneficial to physical space as well as digital space. Just some out-of-the-box thinking. But a lot of that's dictated by funding platforms too. Like it's like you need a body in space. Well, maybe that needs to change a little bit.
We're doing this addition to the law building out in British Columbia at the University of Victoria. And in one of the early sessions, we heard one of the traditional chiefs talking about a walk through the forest as kind of this cleansing action, right? Where you walk through and the branches sort of physically rub up against you. So when you leave the forest, you've got this feeling like your spirit has been cleansed. And so at that very point, it really kind of resonated with the design team, that story, and the building became less of an object building and became more of kind of this landscape of mountains and valleys that you kind of walk through. And we wouldn't have got there without giving ourselves the privilege of talking to him. So it was a game changer.
Wow.
What a nice example, because it talks about the experience, right? I don't know that I can respond to spectacle, because I'm not particularly interested in spectacle per se. But the way Brian explained experience and the thoughtfulness in the design process of creating opportunities for experiences that are not prescribed, that are not ready-made selfie Instagram moments, but rather inspire people to think in ways in which they didn't think or in which they didn't experience before. In my life as an architect, people have asked me to create wow moments. I'm wowed every day. I don't know how to create a wow moment in architecture. If that helps you, I'm ready to entertain anything, but it's on a sort of slow cooking analogy, if you know what I mean.
Well, I think we should take your question. Yes.
Thank you very much to all of you. Fascinating session. My name is Tom DeQuino. I'm visiting from Ottawa. Great honor to be here tonight. I was a youngster in Pierre Trudeau's office when David Rockefeller and the Prime Minister decided to get this thing underway, and I congratulate all of you for all that you have brought to the relationship. My question is the following, and let me precede it with just a brief comment. We talked about AI. We heard what Sarah said about the speed with which things are changing. I think one of the great challenges for museums is, especially in the face of this incredible change, is how we preserve and honor the past, and at the same time prepare ourselves with an open mind for the future. As you know, this has become a subject of what some people call the cultural wars. I know as a Canadian, I've learned from our Indigenous and First Nations people the enormous importance of tradition. One must not forget the past. One learns a great deal from the past. In my view, that's very, very important in art, historical art, contemporary art. So from your various perspectives, how do you see dealing with this incredibly delicate balance, which today I think is more important than ever that we address?
I really kind of appreciate the dialogue. One of the things I really appreciate about the AGO is how when they hang pieces, they'll hang something that's considered to be very sort of classical against something that could be considered leading edge, cutting, and I really kind of appreciate the dialogue. Like I'm not one for kind of tearing down statues. I'm one for maybe placing something beside it so that you get some cross-pollination. I mean, I think that's one way you could kind of do it, but.
Go for it.
I think it's collaboration. I think, once again, going back to the expectation that one institution, which is struggling for funds, capacity, and space, can solve all these things. But on the flip side, in collaboration, meaning, I work, my organization, it's very small, it's not big, but we actually, there's the directors and the staff, but for us, the Floyd Museum's the city. So in our mindset, actually, the museums are part of our Floyd Museum, not the other way around, because our missions are about making the city better, right? Which means the museum must be better. But it has, I'm a pragmatist. I'm a pragmatist in understanding the limitations as someone who ran an arts nonprofit. I understand what it means to be a director and have limited funds, but all these pressures coming in about demands because people care about you and they value what you have, but it's just, you can't hit them all. So the way, in my organization, I deal with that is I collaborate. I don't have an urban farming space, even though I value that. I'll go work with the urban farmer organization, right? So we have a networked approach. But on the flip side, that also means you have to let go of control a little bit. It may not come out to be 100% the way I want it. It may be 70% or 80% or 60% sometimes. But that network and that rehearsing over and over and over and doing things together, each time we do things, it gets stronger and stronger and stronger. So I think that's our salvation is working with different expertise, very similar to how you are talking about your design process. The landscape architects bringing in ideas. You get the best diversity of ideas, and then you get the best model possible going forward. But no one entity, having one person control everything is very much the antithesis of what a community is. That's the whole point. It's not a community at all. It's just one person making all of the decisions or one organization making all the decisions. So that's a little bit of how I go about it.
I think that you were talking about the past as a thing. We can't invent anything. Well, that's not entirely true, but human art activity repeats itself. When we look at Greek and Roman art, themes emerge that are as relevant today as they ever were. I think learning from the past is interesting, but dialoguing, as Brian said so aptly, is really useful. Whatever the themes may be, ultimately they are about the meaning of life and why we do what we do, or record profound experiences, communicate these experiences with the hope that they bring something to somebody else, expressions of anguish, of fear, of whatever the spectrum may yield. So yes, inspirations from the past, I think, are very, very important, and we cannot lose them, but more than anything, I think we must not be conceited to think that nothing has ever been sort of considered before. And of course, in the context of AI, we're sort of looking at different, I think, of different issues with who we are as humans. Complicated, but whoever said it was going to be simple. Personally, I have to go back to work.
Well, I believe, oh,
Okay. Let's now be done.
I'm all sort of a bit in turmoil listening to all this because there's nothing that's sort of pinned down, and obviously things are in extraordinary flux, but thank you very much. It's been really fascinating. My mind went back to 1970 when I was doing my master's in philosophy, and my chosen loved subject was the philosophy of art. And the key question that was asked, and I think continues to be asked, is what is art and what makes good art good art? And of course, there's absolutely wonderfully amazing ideas that come up. But I guess I'm wondering, from what you've said, and given that, you know, that means there are boundaries. If you're going to define what is art and what's not, and what's good art and what's not good art, there are boundaries. And we're talking about, are there any boundaries anymore? Or if they are, what are they? And then you said at one point, I forget which one of you said, well, you know, of course we engage and we listen to people very carefully and all the rest of it. I think, Brian, you even said one thing that you wrote down sort of a synopsis of what you did. But you don't, it's not that you're asking these people to tell you what to do and how to do it. So that means if you're not asking them, if that's not why you're asking, there are boundaries, I think, in your minds too, that make something art or not art, or good architecture or not good architecture. So let me just put the question back to you. I mean, are there boundaries? And if there are, kind of how would you attempt to define them in this vast, ever-changing world?
That'll be another symposium. But the short answer would be yes, of course. Yes. Of course we establish ideas about quality. I think architecture is a discipline, and you can live up to the expectations of that discipline. There is such a thing as a well-built building. There are spaces that are better than others, but the fine points of that are, I really wonder whether they're any more difficult than they ever were. You know, 1906, the salons in Paris decided whether this person was in it or not in it. I think that discussion has always existed. Michelangelo tore his hair out worrying about his marbles. And lucky us that we continue to get to debate it. Lucky us that it's not everything is just produced and just accepted. So in my mind, probably too much.
That's spot on.
well, I think we may have come to the end of our time available, sadly. And I'd like to pass it over to Vicki Hayman and
Thank you, Bridget. And actually, I want to thank each of you individually for this incredibly rich and meaningful conversation. Really, this is the heart of CCAR, and this is really what we are about, is bringing together, through art, dialogue, and our two countries to greater understanding and hopefully better platforms and paradigms for the future. This is really meaningful. And it's a really meaningful part of our time here in New York over the last couple days. So thank you. My name is Vicki Hayman, and I'm a board member of CCAR and also a long-standing supporter. And what I want to say, what I think I've taken away from this conversation today, is where we can all go in our individual practices and lives and continue thinking about these structures that we're supporting and building and how we can make them the best that they can be. And I really look forward to and hope that you all will join us in the future for more conversations like this. This is exactly, what we aspire to do and what we aspire to do well, and we invite you to be part of that through, sharing and contributing to CCAR and sharing in numbers of our activities. And on behalf of CCAR, I want to thank our program sponsors, the Hal Jackman Foundation, the Embassy of Canada, the Consul General of Canada, New York, the National Arts Club of New York, and to our annual sponsors, the Donner Canadian Foundation, RBC, McCarthy Terrault, Tories, Skadden, Arp, Slate, Maher and Floam, and Dorsey and Whitney. And also a really special thanks to the Museum of Modern Art. I think it was a really bold and welcoming statement on behalf of the museum to have this conversation, it's a challenging one, and to also do it here in the heart of one of the finest art institutions in the world. So we really thank you for that. And I really want to invite you all to, please join us in our circle of friends. You can do that by going to our website. It's very simple, ccar-newyork.org. And you can read more about the platforms and the things that we engage in. We support approximately 250 cross-border cultural institutions, and we do that through supports of fellowships and scholarships and programming. And it's a really, like this, very reflective of the great dialogues that we can have together. So I want to thank you all for being here, and thank you for participating, and look forward to many more fruitful conversations. So thank you all.